They laughed when the struggling veteran inherited a worthless old cabinet, until his loyal German shepherd uncovered something inside worth $270 million. When Caleb Dawson stood quietly at the back of the room during his aunt's will reading, no one paid much attention to him. His cousins argued loudly over cash, property, and everything they believed was valuable. Then the lawyer announced Caleb's inheritance, an old wooden armoire that everyone in the family had always called junk. Laughter filled the room. But weeks later, in a quiet mountain cabin far from the greed and noise, Caleb's German shepherd, Atlas, began pawing at the cabinet like something inside was calling to him. What the dog discovered hidden within that worthless piece of furniture would change Caleb's life forever. Before we continue the story, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today, your city, state, or country. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. The wind moved slowly through the tall pine trees that surrounded the small cabin on the edge of Silver Ridge, Colorado. Early morning light spilled over the Rocky Mountains, painting the snow-dusted peaks in pale gold. It should have been peaceful. But inside the cabin, peace had always been hard to find. Caleb Dawson sat on the edge of his narrow bed, breathing slowly, his hands pressed against his knees. His heart was still racing. Another nightmare. The same one. Dust. Smoke. The sound of a blast tearing through the air. The scream of a radio cutting in and out. He closed his eyes and tried to steady himself. The war had ended 8 years ago. But some nights, Afghanistan still lived in his bones. A low whine came from beside the bed. Caleb looked down. Atlas was already there. The large German shepherd lifted his head, dark eyes steady and calm. His thick black and tan coat caught the dim morning light coming through the window. Without hesitation, Atlas moved closer and leaned his weight gently against Caleb's leg. Caleb exhaled slowly. "You're on duty early, huh?" he muttered. Atlas thumped his tail once against the wooden floor. Caleb ran a hand over the dog's head, fingers brushing the scar that ran faintly across Atlas's ear. A reminder of a life the two of them had shared before Colorado, before the quiet. Atlas hadn't always been just a companion. Years ago, he had been a military working dog assigned to Caleb's unit. In the desert heat of Kandahar, Atlas had sniffed out explosives, guarded checkpoints, and once pulled Caleb behind a wall seconds before an IED detonated. That day, Atlas had saved his life. Now, Atlas saved him in different ways. From nightmares, from silence, from the long, empty hours that stretched between sunrise and nightfall. Caleb stood slowly and crossed the small cabin floor. The wood creaked beneath his boots. The place wasn't much, just one room with a narrow kitchen along the wall and a wood-burning stove near the center. But it was enough. Outside, frost clung to the pickup truck parked near the dirt road. It was old, rust creeping along the edges, but it still ran. And Caleb needed it to run. Work didn't come easy in a town like Silver Ridge. The population barely reached 2,000 people, most of them ranchers or farmers scattered across the valleys and hillsides. Caleb fixed things. Tractors that refused to start. Broken irrigation pumps. Fence posts knocked loose by winter storms. Whatever work came his way, he took it. Not because it paid well, but because it kept his hands busy. And busy hands made the memories quieter. Atlas followed him to the door as Caleb stepped outside. The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of pine and distant snow. The mountains rose like silent giants in the distance. Beautiful. Unforgiving. Caleb stood there for a moment, letting the cold wake him up. Behind him, Atlas moved with quiet patience, scanning the tree line the way he had been trained years ago. Even here, far from any battlefield, the dog carried himself like a soldier still on watch. Caleb sometimes wondered if Atlas had the same memories he did. If certain sounds still echoed somewhere inside that loyal head. If thunder reminded him of explosions. A pickup truck rumbled down the dirt road toward the cabin. Caleb turned. It was old Mr. Halverson from the neighboring ranch. The truck slowed and stopped near the gate. Halverson leaned out the window. "Morning, Dawson." Caleb gave a small nod. "Morning." Halverson glanced at Atlas, who stood alert but calm beside Caleb. "That dog still sticking with you everywhere?" "Yeah." "Good dog." "The best." Halverson scratched his beard thoughtfully. "My tractor stalled again yesterday," he said. "Fuel pump's acting up." Caleb grabbed his tool bag from the porch without hesitation. "I can take a look." Halverson nodded. "Figured you might." He hesitated a moment before adding quietly, "Town meeting's talking about your aunt again." Caleb paused. "My aunt?" "Margaret Lawson." The name hung in the cold air. Caleb hadn't heard it spoken out loud in years. Margaret Lawson had been the only person in the Dawson family who treated him like something more than a broken soldier. She used to send him letters while he was deployed. Short ones, sometimes just a few lines. But they always ended the same way. "Come visit when you're home." Caleb never had. The war had ended. Life had gotten complicated. Time had passed. Halverson shifted uncomfortably. "Heard she passed 2 nights ago." Caleb didn't move. The mountains seemed suddenly very quiet. Atlas looked up at him. Halverson spoke more softly now. "Funerals in Wyoming. Family gathering and all that." Caleb swallowed slowly. His family. Victor. Diane. Trevor. People who had stopped calling years ago. People who had decided somewhere along the line that Caleb Dawson wasn't worth the trouble. Halverson cleared his throat. "Anyway," he said gently, "thought you should know." Caleb nodded once. "Thanks." The truck rumbled away down the dirt road. The silence returned. Atlas stepped closer, nudging Caleb's hand with his nose. Caleb scratched behind the dog's ears. "Well, partner," he said quietly, "looks like we're taking a trip." Atlas's ears lifted slightly. Far beyond the pine trees, the snow-covered peaks of the Rockies glowed in the rising sun. Caleb had no idea that the road he was about to take would change everything. Not just his life, but the story everyone thought they knew about him. And somewhere, deep in the quiet of the cabin behind them, the empty corner of the room waited. A space where something heavy, something forgotten, would soon stand. Something everyone else believed was worthless. Something Atlas would notice long before anyone else did. But Caleb Dawson didn't know that yet. 2 days later, his pickup truck rolled slowly along a long stretch of highway that cut through the wide valleys between Colorado and Wyoming. The land felt bigger out here. Endless hills of dry grass, fences stretching for miles, and distant mountains that looked blue beneath the cold autumn sky. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, alert as always, watching the road ahead. Caleb drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting against the door. The truck rattled softly every time it hit a crack in the pavement. It was a long drive to the Lawson Ranch, and neither of them had spoken much. Not that Atlas expected conversation, but the quiet between them felt heavier than usual. Margaret Lawson. Caleb hadn't seen his aunt in almost 6 years, not since a short visit after he came home from the war. She had been older then, but still sharp, still full of that quiet strength that reminded him of someone who had lived through storms and simply decided not to break. She had hugged Atlas longer than she had hugged Caleb. "Smart dog," she had said, scratching the shepherd behind the ears. "You keep him steady." Caleb remembered that. He also remembered how his cousins had watched him that day, like he was something fragile, or worse, embarrassing. The highway curved toward a long gravel road marked by a wooden sign, Lawson Ranch. Caleb slowed the truck and turned onto it. Dust rose behind the tires as they rolled toward the old ranch house. The property was bigger than he remembered. Long wooden barns stretched across the fields, and a wide white farmhouse sat near the center of the land. Several expensive SUVs were already parked outside. Family had arrived. Caleb parked his truck at the far end of the driveway. Atlas stepped out beside him, stretching his long legs before scanning the property carefully. Voices drifted from the house. Heated voices. Caleb walked toward the porch slowly, Atlas at his side. The moment he stepped inside, the argument became clear. Victor Dawson stood near the dining table, his expensive coat hanging over a chair. His voice carried easily across the room. "I'm telling you, Diane, the land alone is worth at least $2 million if we sell it right." Diane Lawson crossed her arms. "Sell it right? Victor, you always say that. Then you hold out for too much and we lose the buyer." Trevor leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. "You two can argue all you want," he said, "but the stock portfolio better be split evenly." No one noticed Caleb at first, until Victor finally looked up. The room went quiet. Victor's eyes moved slowly over Caleb's worn jacket, his boots, the faded truck keys in his hand. Then his gaze dropped to Atlas. "Well," Victor said after a moment, "look who showed up." Diane turned. Her expression tightened slightly. "Caleb." Not warm, not hostile, just uncomfortable. Trevor glanced up from his phone. "Didn't know you still came to family things." Caleb didn't respond. Atlas stepped slightly closer to his side. Victor gave a small, humorless smile. "He probably heard there was money involved." The comment hung in the air. No one laughed, but no one corrected him either. Caleb moved to a chair near the back wall and sat quietly. Atlas lay down beside him, head resting between his paws, watching the room carefully. A few minutes later, the lawyer arrived, Mr. Howard Bell, a thin man in a dark suit carrying a leather briefcase. He placed several folders on the dining table and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he said calmly. "As you know, Margaret Lawson passed peacefully 3 days ago." The room remained silent. "Today we will read the final will and distribute her estate according to her instructions." Victor leaned back in his chair confidently. Diane folded her arms. Trevor finally put his phone away. Caleb sat quietly. Atlas didn't move. Mr. Bell opened the first document. Margaret Lawson's estate includes the ranch property, several investment accounts, vehicles, and personal assets. Victor smiled slightly. Mr. Bell continued reading. To Victor Dawson, she leaves the western pasture land and the attached barn structures. Victor nodded in satisfaction. To Diane Lawson, she leaves the primary residence and its furnishings. Diane exhaled with visible relief. To Trevor Lawson, she leaves the classic vehicle collection stored in the east barn. Trevor sat up immediately. Finally,
Mr. Bell said, turning another page. To Caleb Dawson. The room shifted. Victor glanced over with raised eyebrows. She leaves the antique armoire located in the upstairs guest room. Silence filled the room. Trevor blinked. Diane frowned slightly. Victor leaned forward. The what? Mr. Bell checked the document again.
The antique wooden armoire. Trevor laughed first. A short, sharp sound. You mean that giant old wardrobe thing? Victor chuckled under his breath. That's the inheritance? Diane shook her head slowly. That thing's been sitting in that room since the 70s. Victor leaned back in his chair and looked directly at Caleb. Well, he said with a smirk, looks like Aunt Margaret really knew what to get you. Trevor snorted. Perfect match. A junk cabinet for the family junk soldier. Atlas lifted his head. A low rumble formed in his chest. Caleb placed a hand gently on the dog's neck. Victor waved a hand dismissively. You can have it, Caleb. No one else wants that monster. Caleb looked at the lawyer. Where is it? Mr. Bell glanced up. Second floor, guest room at the end of the hall. Caleb stood slowly. Atlas rose with him. Victor watched with amused curiosity. You're actually taking it? Caleb met his eyes. Yes. Victor laughed again. Well, good. He leaned back in his chair. Because the rest of us are taking the things that actually matter. Caleb didn't respond. He simply walked toward the staircase, Atlas following beside him. Upstairs, the hallway felt strangely quiet. Dust floated in the sunlight coming through the windows. At the end of the hall, the guest room door stood slightly open. Caleb pushed it slowly. Inside, the room looked untouched by time. And there it was, the armoire. Tall, dark oak, heavy. Its carved wooden doors were decorated with intricate patterns, vines, leaves, and a single detailed rose near the center. Atlas stepped forward first. His nose twitched. He circled the large cabinet once. Then he stopped and stared directly at that carved rose. His ears lifted. Something about it had caught his attention. Something no one else in the family had ever noticed. And in that quiet room, Caleb Dawson had no idea that the piece of furniture everyone downstairs believed was worthless was about to become the most valuable thing in the entire house. For now, it was simply a massive piece of furniture standing against the wall. The armoire towered over Caleb, nearly 7 feet tall. Dark oak wood, thick doors, hand-carved details that had probably taken a craftsman weeks to finish. Dust clung lightly to the surface, but the structure itself was solid, far stronger than most modern furniture. Atlas stepped closer. His nose moved slowly across the wood, tracing the carved vines and leaves that wrapped around the center panels. He paused at the rose. The dog tilted his head slightly. Then he sniffed again. Caleb watched him quietly. What is it, boy? Atlas didn't bark. He didn't scratch. He simply stood there staring at the carved rose as if it meant something. Caleb ran a hand across the wood. Cold, smooth, heavy. It looked old, real old. He opened one of the doors. The hinges creaked softly. Inside was empty space, just a hanging rod and a few wooden shelves. Nothing special. Still, the cabinet itself must have weighed several hundred pounds. Moving it down the narrow staircase was going to be a challenge. Caleb closed the doors again and stepped back. Guess you're coming home with us, he muttered. Atlas gave one last sniff at the carved rose before stepping away. Downstairs, the argument had resumed. Victor stood near the dining table, looking over papers with the lawyer. Diane leaned against the counter with a glass of water, while Trevor scrolled through his phone again. Victor glanced up when Caleb entered the room. "So," he said with a grin, "you found your treasure?" Caleb didn't respond. He walked past them toward the front door. Victor called after him. "You taking that thing today?" "Yes." Victor laughed.
Good luck moving it,
Trevor added without looking up. "You'll need a forklift." Diane shook her head. "That cabinet weighs a ton." Caleb paused at the doorway. "Where's the barn?" Victor pointed lazily out the window. "East side of the property." "Tools?" Trevor jerked his thumb toward the same direction. "Workshop." Caleb nodded once. Atlas followed him outside. The cold Wyoming wind swept across the ranch yard as they crossed toward the large red barn. The doors groaned when Caleb pushed them open. Inside, dust floated through thin beams of sunlight. Old tools lined the walls: dollies, ropes, crowbars, hand trucks. Caleb grabbed a heavy-duty furniture dolly and a few thick straps. Atlas sat nearby, watching him work. "Let's see if we can get that monster down the stairs," Caleb said. The process took nearly an hour. Caleb braced the dolly against the armoire and slowly tilted the heavy cabinet forward. The wood groaned under the shift in weight. Atlas stayed at the base of the staircase, watching carefully as Caleb eased the cabinet down one step at a time. The stairs creaked with every movement. Halfway down, the cabinet shifted suddenly. Caleb's boots slipped slightly on the edge of the step. The armoire lurched forward. Atlas barked sharply. Caleb tightened his grip on the straps and leaned his entire weight back against the dolly. The heavy cabinet slammed against the stair rail, but stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Caleb breathed out slowly. "That was close," he murmured. Atlas wagged his tail once, but kept his eyes fixed on the cabinet. Finally, they reached the bottom of the stairs. Caleb wiped sweat from his forehead and rolled the armoire out onto the porch. Victor appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee. "Well, I'll be," he said. "You actually got it down." Caleb didn't answer. Victor walked around the cabinet, knocking lightly on the wood. "You know," he said casually, "someone might give you $50 for this thing at an antique store." Trevor came outside behind him. "50? I'd say 20. Diane stepped onto the porch, arms folded. "Honestly, Caleb," she said, "why bother?" Caleb tightened the straps around the cabinet. "Because it's mine." Victor smirked. "Suit yourself." They watched as Caleb slowly rolled the massive armoire across the gravel driveway toward his pickup truck. The cabinet barely fit into the truck bed. Caleb secured it with heavy ropes and checked each knot carefully. Atlas jumped into the passenger seat. Victor leaned against the porch railing. "You drove all this way for a junk cabinet." Caleb climbed into the driver's seat. Victor called out one last time. "You know what the funny part is?" Caleb paused but didn't look back. Victor grinned. "That thing is probably the only thing Aunt Margaret owned that isn't worth anything." Caleb closed the truck door. The engine turned over with a rough growl. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as the truck rolled down the long ranch driveway. Victor watched it disappear toward the open highway. Behind him, Diane shook her head. "Waste of gas," she said. Trevor shrugged. "Let him have it." None of them gave the cabinet another thought. Miles away, the pickup truck moved slowly through the Wyoming plains. Atlas sat upright beside Caleb, eyes forward. Behind them, tied tightly in the truck bed, the massive oak armoire rattled softly with every bump in the road. And as the truck crossed the long, empty highway back toward the mountains of Colorado, Atlas suddenly turned his head.
His ears lifted. He stared through the rear window at the cabinet, at the carved rose on its door. The same rose that had caught his attention upstairs. The same rose that no one else had noticed. Atlas let out a low, thoughtful rumble. Caleb glanced over. "What is it, boy?" Atlas didn't answer.
But his eyes never left the armoire behind them. As if he knew there was something hidden inside it. Something waiting to be discovered. But the road home was long, and Caleb Dawson was too tired to think about mysteries. The mountains of Colorado rose slowly along the horizon as the sun began to sink lower in the sky. The pickup truck hummed steadily along the narrow highway, the engine rattling every now and then, as if reminding Caleb that it had already lived a long life. Atlas remained quiet in the passenger seat, but every few minutes, the German shepherd turned his head and stared through the rear window. At the armoire. The cabinet shifted slightly in the truck bed each time the vehicle hit a bump in the road. The ropes Caleb had tied held it firmly in place, but the old wood creaked softly under the movement. Atlas watched it carefully. Caleb noticed. "You've been staring at that thing for the last 50 miles, he said with a tired smile. Atlas flicked one ear. "Relax," Caleb added. "It's just a cabinet." The dog looked forward again, but his alert posture never changed. They reached Silver Ridge after dark. The small mountain town looked the same as always. A single gas station with flickering lights. A diner still open along Main Street. Pickup trucks parked outside the grocery store. Quiet, slow, unchanging. Caleb turned down the narrow dirt road leading toward his cabin. The headlights cut through the darkness between the tall pine trees that lined the road. Snow from the previous week still rested in thin patches along the ground. The truck rolled to a stop outside the small wooden cabin. Caleb turned off the engine. Silence returned. Atlas jumped down from the passenger seat and stretched his long legs before scanning the surrounding trees the way he always did. Habit. Training. Caleb walked around to the back of the truck. The armoire looked even larger now under the dim porch light. Its dark wood reflected the faint glow like something pulled out of another century. "Well," Caleb muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Let's get you inside." He lowered the tailgate and pulled the heavy cabinet toward the edge of the truck bed. Even with the furniture dolly he had brought from the ranch, the weight was enormous. Atlas stood nearby, watching closely. "Don't just stand there," Caleb joked. "You could at least pretend to help." Atlas wagged his tail once. It took nearly 20 minutes to maneuver the armoire off the truck and onto the wooden porch. Caleb used the dolly carefully, inching the cabinet forward a few feet at a time. His muscles burned. Cold air filled his lungs with every breath. Finally, the cabinet reached the front door. The problem became immediately obvious. The armoire barely fit. Caleb measured the doorway with his eyes. "Of course," he sighed. He tilted the cabinet sideways and slowly rolled it through the doorway. The wood scraped lightly against the doorframe before sliding inside. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller. The armoire now stood against the far wall beside the window, towering over the small kitchen table and the worn couch. Caleb stepped back. "Well, that's subtle." Atlas approached the cabinet immediately. His nose pressed against the wood again. He walked slowly around it once, then again. This time he paused longer at the carved rose on the front panel. The same rose he had stared at in the ranch house. Atlas sniffed the wood carefully.
Then he sat down in front of it and waited. Caleb noticed. "What is it with you and this thing?" He walked over and opened the cabinet doors again. Inside was exactly what he had seen earlier. Empty shelves, a hanging rod, dust, nothing else. Caleb closed the doors. "See?" he said. "Nothing in there." Atlas didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the carved rose. Caleb shook his head with a tired chuckle.
"You're losing it, buddy." He walked toward the kitchen and poured some water into a metal bowl for the dog. Atlas eventually joined him, drinking slowly. Afterward, Caleb threw a couple of logs into the wood stove and lit a fire. Orange flames flickered gently inside the metal chamber, warming the small room. The long drive had drained him. The past few days had drained him even more. Family arguments, old memories, Margaret Lawson. Caleb sank into the worn couch and leaned his head back. Atlas curled up near the fire. For a moment, the cabin felt peaceful again. Outside, the wind moved quietly through the pine trees. Caleb closed his eyes. But sleep did not come easily. It never did. Somewhere after midnight, thunder rolled across the mountains. The sound cracked through the sky like a distant explosion. Caleb's eyes snapped open. His breathing instantly grew sharp. Darkness surrounded him. Another thunderclap. For a moment, his mind was no longer in Colorado. Sand, heat, gunfire echoing across broken buildings. His chest tightened. The memory gripped him. Then suddenly, Atlas was there. The German shepherd pressed his body against Caleb's leg, just like he had done hundreds of times before, grounding him. Caleb focused on the dog's steady breathing. 1, 2, 3. The counting helped. It always did. The thunder faded slowly into the distance. Caleb exhaled. "Good boy," he whispered. Atlas stayed close. The cabin returned to silence. But as Caleb sat there catching his breath, Atlas suddenly lifted his head again. His ears turned toward the far wall, toward the armoire. The dog stood, slowly. He walked across the room and stopped in front of the cabinet. Caleb watched from the couch. "What now?" Atlas sniffed the carved rose again. This time longer, more focused. Then the German shepherd raised one paw and gently tapped the wooden panel. Tap, tap. The sound echoed faintly through the quiet cabin. Caleb frowned. Atlas tapped the wood again. The sound was different, not solid, hollow. Caleb slowly stood up. "What did you find, boy?" He walked across the room. Atlas stepped aside but kept staring at the rose. Caleb ran his fingers across the carved flower. The wood felt smooth, old, but something about it felt loose. He pressed the carving lightly. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. Atlas let out a soft whine. Caleb leaned closer. "All right," he murmured. "Let's take a better look tomorrow." He stepped back and stretched his tired shoulders. But Atlas didn't move. He remained sitting in front of the cabinet, eyes locked on the carved rose, as if the dog knew something Caleb did not, as if the cabinet was trying to tell them a secret. And somewhere deep inside that massive block of oak, a hidden space waited quietly in the darkness. A space no one in Caleb's family had ever discovered. A space that would soon change everything. Morning in the mountains arrived slowly. A pale gray light crept through the pine trees and slipped between the curtains of Caleb Dawson's cabin. The fire in the stove had burned low overnight, leaving only a faint warmth in the room. Caleb woke on the couch, his neck stiff, his back aching. Atlas lay on the floor nearby, but the dog was already awake. His ears were upright, his gaze fixed across the room. At the armoire. The cabinet stood exactly where Caleb had left it the night before, tall and silent against the wall. The carved rose at the center of its doors caught the first thin ray of sunlight entering through the window. Atlas stood and walked toward it again. Caleb watched from the couch. "You're still thinking about that thing?" Atlas didn't answer. The dog approached the cabinet and sniffed along the wood slowly, carefully, just as he had done in the military when searching vehicles for explosives. The same deliberate pattern. Left side, right side, then the center. He stopped at the rose again. Caleb sat up. "That's the third time you've checked that spot." Atlas lifted one paw and touched the panel lightly. Tap. The sound echoed faintly. Hollow again. Caleb frowned. He stood and walked across the room. Up close, the cabinet smelled faintly of old oak and dust. The wood had the worn softness of something that had existed for generations. He ran his fingers along the carved vines surrounding the rose. "Maybe there's a gap somewhere," he murmured. Atlas sat beside him, watching every movement. Caleb opened the cabinet doors again. Empty shelves, nothing unusual. He knocked gently on the inside wall. Solid. He knocked again on the outside panel where Atlas had tapped. The sound changed. Not solid. Not entirely hollow either. Something in between. Caleb stepped back and studied the cabinet carefully. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's measure it." He walked to the small kitchen drawer and pulled out a tape measure. Atlas followed closely. Caleb measured the width of the cabinet from the outside. 42 inches, he muttered. Then he measured the interior. 38. He paused. Measured again. Still 38. Caleb slowly lowered the tape measure. "That's strange." Atlas's tail thumped softly against the floor. Caleb measured the depth next. Outside, 23 inches. Inside, 19. He stepped back again. There's 4 inches missing on every side. The realization settled slowly in his mind. The cabinet was larger on the outside than it should be, which meant one thing. There was empty space somewhere between the outer walls and the inner structure. A hidden compartment. Atlas gave a soft bark. "Yeah," Caleb said under his breath. "I'm starting to think you're right." He examined the cabinet again, running his hands across every carved line. The rose sat directly in the center of the door panel. It looked ordinary, but the wood around it felt slightly different. The carving itself moved just barely when he pressed against it. Caleb leaned closer. "Did you see that?" Atlas wagged his tail once. Caleb pushed again. Nothing happened. He pressed harder. Still nothing. "Maybe it's jammed," he said. Atlas let out a quiet whine. Caleb stepped away and rubbed his chin. "Let's try something else." He walked to his toolbox near the door and grabbed a small flashlight. When he returned, he knelt beside the cabinet and shined the light along the edges of the panel. There, a tiny seam, so thin it was almost invisible, running around the carved rose. Caleb felt his pulse quicken. "Well, I'll be." He placed his thumb against the center of the rose carving. Atlas leaned forward. "Here goes nothing." Caleb pushed. At first, nothing happened. Then, click. The sound was soft, barely audible, but both of them heard it. Atlas's ears shot straight up. Caleb froze. Slowly, the wooden panel shifted inward a fraction of an inch. A hidden latch had released. Caleb stared at it in disbelief. "You found it." Atlas wagged his tail harder now. Caleb gently pulled the panel forward. It resisted for a moment. Then the entire section of wood slid sideways with a quiet scraping sound. Behind it, darkness. A narrow vertical chamber stretched upward inside the cabinet wall. Caleb raised the flashlight and aimed it into the opening. Something was inside, stacked tightly, wrapped in thick wax paper bundles tied with old string. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Caleb reached inside slowly and pulled one out. The bundle was heavy. He untied the string, carefully peeled back the wax paper, and froze. Inside the wrapping were crisp stacks of US $100 bills. Atlas let out a low, excited bark. Caleb sat back on the floor, stunned. No way. His hands trembled as he opened another bundle. More cash. Stack after stack. He shined the flashlight deeper into the chamber. The entire hidden space was filled with identical bundles. Row after row, floor to ceiling. Atlas circled excitedly, tail sweeping the floor. Caleb leaned against the cabinet, staring at the money. For a long time, he didn't move, didn't speak. The quiet cabin suddenly felt very small and very unreal. Finally, he whispered the only words that came to mind. "My God." The cabin felt different now. The same wooden walls, the same quiet morning light filtering through the pine trees. But something had shifted in the air, like the room itself understood that a secret had just been uncovered. Caleb Dawson remained sitting on the floor in front of the armoire. Atlas stood beside him, tail wagging slowly, watching his every movement. The bundle of cash rested in Caleb's hands. Real. Heavy. He peeled back the wax paper again, just to be certain his eyes weren't lying. Rows of $100 bills stared back at him. He swallowed. "Atlas." The German shepherd tilted his head slightly. "You seeing this too?" Atlas gave a short bark, as if answering yes. Caleb placed the bundle gently on the floor and reached into the hidden compartment again. Another bundle. Then another. Each one identical. Thick stacks of tightly packed bills. Caleb pulled several bundles out and laid them carefully across the wooden floorboards. The piles grew quickly. 10 bundles. 20. 30. He stopped when the small clearing in front of the cabinet was filled. Atlas sat beside the stacks, guarding them instinctively, his dark eyes scanning the room. Caleb leaned back against the cabinet and rubbed both hands across his face. This can't be real. He reached for one bundle and flipped through the bills. Crisp. Clean. Old, but perfectly preserved. These weren't random scraps of forgotten cash. They had been packed deliberately, stored carefully, hidden with intention. Caleb grabbed a calculator from the small desk near the window and returned to the floor. He counted the bills in one bundle. $10,000. His chest tightened. He counted the bundles he had already pulled out. 32. $320,000. And that was just the small portion sitting on the floor. He slowly turned his flashlight back toward the hidden chamber. The beam illuminated row after row of identical bundles stretching deep into the walls of the cabinet. Atlas followed the light with his eyes. Caleb whispered quietly, "There's hundreds more." He leaned closer, shining the light further upward. The hidden chamber ran nearly the entire height of the cabinet, every inch filled, every gap stacked with money. Caleb slowly lowered the flashlight. "Atlas, that could be millions." The word echoed in the quiet room. Millions. The kind of number Caleb had never even imagined having in his lifetime. He had spent years working farm equipment jobs that paid barely enough to keep gas in his truck and food on the table. Now he sat in front of a hidden fortune. His heart pounded. But instead of excitement, fear crept in first. Where did this come from? Atlas watched him quietly. Caleb stood up and paced across the cabin. His mind raced through possibilities. Drug money, crime money, something illegal. If that was the case, touching it could bring trouble he didn't want anywhere near his life. He stopped and looked back at the cabinet. Atlas remained seated beside the piles of cash like a silent guard. "Margaret," Caleb whispered. His aunt had left him this cabinet. No one else. Not Victor, not Diane, not Trevor. Him. That meant something. Caleb knelt down again and began inspecting the interior of the compartment more carefully. Behind the stacks of money, something else caught the beam of the flashlight. A thin leather envelope, tucked flat against the back wall. Caleb reached inside and carefully pulled it out. Dust fell from the edges. The envelope was sealed, but not locked. His name was written across the front in neat handwriting. Caleb. He recognized the writing instantly. Margaret Lawson's. His chest tightened again. Atlas stepped closer. Caleb opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a folded letter. He unfolded the paper with careful hands. The handwriting was steady, strong. Caleb began to read. "Caleb, if you are reading this, then you did exactly what I hoped you would do. You took the Armoire when no one else would." Caleb paused. Atlas sat quietly beside him. He continued. "The rest of the family always saw value in numbers, in accounts and land and things they could sell quickly. You never did. You saw value in people, in loyalty, in things that last." Caleb's throat tightened. "I hid this money many years ago after selling my company. I knew that if the others ever discovered it, they would fight over it until nothing remained. But you, Caleb, you are different." Caleb's eyes moved slowly across the page. "This cabinet has waited for someone patient enough to notice it, someone observant enough to question it, and someone kind enough to deserve it." Atlas rested his head gently on Caleb's knee. Caleb whispered the final line aloud. "Take care of yourself, and take care of that remarkable dog, Margaret." The cabin fell silent again. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pine trees. Caleb folded the letter slowly. His eyes moved back toward the hidden chamber filled with cash, toward the fortune that had been sitting unnoticed inside a piece of furniture everyone else had mocked. Atlas stood and placed one paw gently on Caleb's leg. Caleb looked at him. "Well, partner," he said quietly. "Looks like you really did find something." Atlas wagged his tail. But neither of them knew yet that discovering the money was only the beginning. Because somewhere far away, Victor Dawson was already starting to ask questions. But Caleb Dawson didn't know that yet. Inside the small cabin at the edge of Silver Ridge, The morning had grown brighter. Sunlight stretched across the wooden floor, touching the scattered bundles of cash that lay in front of the open armoire. Caleb sat quietly on the floor. The letter from Margaret rested in his hand. Atlas sat beside him like a silent guard. For a long time, Caleb didn't move. He simply looked at the stacks of money, then at the cabinet, then back at the letter. His mind struggled to accept what his eyes had already proven. 300,000 out here already, he muttered. His gaze shifted to the hidden chamber again. Row after row of tightly wrapped bundles filled the space behind the wooden panel. Carefully packed, carefully hidden. For years, maybe decades. Caleb exhaled slowly. This isn't just a little stash. Atlas wagged his tail once. Caleb reached for the calculator again. One bundle. $10,000. He counted the rows he could see inside the cabinet. 5 rows across, at least 12 bundles high. And the chamber ran deep into the wall. He estimated quickly. 60 bundles per section. He paused. There are 4 sections. He tapped the calculator. 600,000 per section, times 4. 2.4 million. Caleb leaned back. His heart began pounding again. But then he noticed something else. The chamber didn't stop where he thought it would. The flashlight beam revealed another vertical slot behind the first. Another hidden column of bundles. Atlas barked once. Caleb leaned closer. You're kidding. He reached deeper inside. More stacks. More bundles. This wasn't a simple hiding place. It was an entire internal structure built into the cabinet. A second wall. A hidden safe made entirely from wood. Caleb's breath grew shallow. He started counting again. Row after row. Column after column. The numbers climbed quickly. 10 million. 20. 50. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed the calculator buttons. Atlas watched him with curious eyes. Caleb stared at the final number, then stared again. $270 million. He lowered the calculator slowly. That can't be right. He recalculated. Again. Same number. $270 million. Caleb let out a quiet laugh that sounded more like disbelief than joy. Atlas, do you understand what that means? Atlas wagged his tail slowly. Caleb looked around the small cabin. The worn couch, the cracked wooden table, the old pickup truck outside. Everything in his life had always been small, careful, simple. Now there was a fortune sitting 10 feet away from him. A fortune hidden inside a piece of furniture his entire family had mocked. Caleb rubbed his temples. We can't just leave it like this. Atlas tilted his head. If someone finds out... The thought hung unfinished in the air. Caleb stood and began carefully placing the bundles back into the chamber. Atlas followed his movements closely. One by one, the stacks disappeared back into the hidden space. It took nearly an hour. When the last bundle was back inside, Caleb slid the wooden panel shut again. The mechanism clicked softly. The carved rose returned to its original place. The cabinet looked ordinary again. Just an old piece of furniture. Caleb stepped back. No one would guess the truth. He picked up Margaret's letter and read it again. You are different, the words said. Caleb looked at Atlas. Guess she believed in you, too. Atlas wagged his tail proudly. Caleb folded the letter and placed it inside a small metal box in the kitchen drawer. For now, the secret would stay between them. He walked back to the armoire and rested a hand on its wooden surface. "All right," he said quietly. "We take this slow." Atlas sat beside him. Outside, the wind brushed through the pine trees. The mountains stood silent around the cabin. But far away in Wyoming, Victor Dawson sat inside the ranch house, staring at paperwork spread across the dining table. Diane stood nearby. Trevor leaned against the wall. Victor tapped a pen against the table thoughtfully. "There's something strange about that cabinet," he said. Diane frowned. "It's just furniture." Victor shook his head. "No." He leaned back in his chair. "Aunt Margaret never did anything without a reason." Trevor shrugged. "Caleb got the junk. We got the money." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's what bothers me." Diane crossed her arms. "What are you thinking?" Victor stood slowly. "I think Caleb Dawson got something we didn't." Trevor laughed. "Yeah, a 7-foot wardrobe." Victor didn't laugh. He picked up his phone. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe we should take a closer look." Back in Colorado, Caleb stepped outside his cabin as the sun began to set behind the mountains. Atlas followed him onto the porch. The evening air was calm, peaceful. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something unfamiliar. Hope. But inside the cabin behind him, the old armoire stood silently against the wall, holding a secret worth hundreds of millions. A secret that was about to change Caleb Dawson's life in ways he never imagined. And soon, others would come looking for it. But the mountains kept their secrets for a little while longer. For the next several days, Caleb Dawson lived exactly as he always had. The cabin stood quiet beneath the tall pines. The same gravel road curled through the trees. The same pickup truck rattled down the mountain toward town each morning. Nothing about Caleb's routine changed. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The armoire remained in the corner of the cabin, silent and ordinary, its carved rose facing the room like it always had. No one would guess that behind that wooden panel rested a fortune large enough to change entire cities. Caleb kept the secret to himself, and to Atlas. The dog rarely left the cabinet's side when Caleb was home. Sometimes Atlas would lie directly in front of it, head resting on his paws, watching the room the way a soldier guards a post. Caleb noticed the behavior. "You're taking this guard dog thing pretty seriously," he said one evening. Atlas thumped his tail against the floor. The fire crackled in the stove as snow began falling gently outside the window. Caleb sat at the small kitchen table with Margaret's letter in his hands again. He had read it many times already, but each time, new meaning settled into the words. "You saw value in things that last." He stared at the sentence for a long moment. Margaret had known her family better than anyone. Victor loved numbers. Diane loved appearances. Trevor loved shortcuts. But Margaret had never trusted any of them with something like this. Instead, she had hidden the money in plain sight, inside something everyone dismissed. Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked across the room at the cabinet. "Why me?" he murmured quietly. Atlas looked up. Caleb walked over to the armoire and ran his hand across the wood again. He had closed the hidden compartment carefully after discovering the money, sliding the panel back until the mechanism clicked into place. Now the cabinet looked completely ordinary. No seams, no signs, just an old piece of furniture. Caleb opened the doors again. Empty shelves, dust, nothing unusual. If someone came searching, they would see exactly what everyone else had always seen. Junk. He closed the doors again and stepped away. But the thought that someone might come searching had begun to grow inside his mind. Victor. Caleb knew his cousin well enough to understand one thing. Victor never stopped chasing money, not when there was even the smallest chance of more. Caleb returned to the kitchen table and unfolded Margaret's letter again. This time he read it more slowly. Every word, every line. Near the bottom of the page, he noticed something he had missed before. A second paragraph, smaller, almost like an afterthought. Caleb, if the money inside the cabinet ever brings trouble to your door, remember something important. The real value was never the money. It was always what someone chooses to do with it. Caleb stared at the words. He folded the letter again and placed it carefully back inside the envelope. Atlas walked over and rested his head against Caleb's knee. Caleb scratched behind the dog's ear. "Sounds like she trusted you too," he said quietly. Atlas wagged his tail once. Outside, the snow began falling heavier. The mountains disappeared slowly behind white mist and drifting flakes. For the first time in many years, Caleb allowed himself to imagine something different. A future where he didn't wake up every day worrying about bills. A future where he could help other veterans like him. Men who came home carrying the same invisible weight he carried. Atlas lifted his head suddenly. His ears stood straight. Caleb noticed immediately. "What is it?" Atlas turned toward the window. A moment later, the faint sound of tires crunching through snow drifted up the narrow mountain road. Headlights appeared between the trees. Caleb stood slowly. No one visited his cabin at night, especially not during a snowstorm. The vehicle moved slowly up the drive and stopped near the porch. A black SUV. Its engine idled quietly. Atlas stood between Caleb and the door, alert but silent. Caleb stepped closer to the window. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. Even through the falling snow, Caleb recognized the shape of that walk. Victor Dawson. Caleb felt his chest tighten. Atlas let out a low growl. Caleb whispered softly, "Easy." Outside, Victor Dawson looked up at the cabin lights glowing through the snow. Then he began walking toward the porch. Inside the cabin, the armoire stood silently against the wall, the carved rose catching the faint glow of firelight. And behind that wooden panel, $270 million waited quietly in the dark. A secret that was no longer quite as safe as it had been yesterday. The knock on the cabin door came slowly. 3 heavy taps. The kind of knock that didn't ask politely. It expected to be answered. Caleb Dawson stood still in the center of the room. Atlas was already between him and the door, shoulders stiff, ears forward. A low warning growl vibrated deep in the German shepherd's chest. Snow tapped softly against the cabin windows. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, Victor Dawson's silhouette moved faintly behind the frosted glass. Another knock. "Caleb." Victor's voice carried through the door. "I know you're in there." Caleb exhaled slowly. He rested a hand on Atlas's back. "Easy." The dog's growl softened but did not disappear. Caleb walked to the door and opened it. Cold mountain wind rushed into the cabin. Victor stood on the porch with snow gathering on his shoulders. His expensive coat looked out of place on the narrow wooden steps, and his polished boots were already coated in white. He smiled. Not warmly, more like a man who believed he had come to collect something. "Well," Victor said casually, "you going to invite me in?"
Caleb stepped aside without speaking. Victor walked into the cabin, brushing snow from his coat as he glanced around the small room. His eyes moved slowly across everything. The old couch, the kitchen table, the wood stove. Then finally, they landed on the armoire. The cabinet stood quietly against the wall, exactly where Caleb had left it. Victor raised an eyebrow.
So you really did haul that thing all the way back here? Caleb closed the door behind him. What do you want? Victor walked closer to the cabinet. Just curious. Atlas stepped forward immediately. The dog placed himself between Victor and the armoire. Victor stopped. He looked down at Atlas and smirked. That thing always that protective? He's trained, Caleb said. Victor nodded slowly. Military dog, right? Atlas didn't move. Victor's eyes returned to the cabinet. Funny thing about Aunt Margaret, he said casually. She never gave away things without a reason. Caleb leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You drove 5 hours in a snowstorm to talk about furniture? Victor chuckled. Not exactly. He turned and faced Caleb. I've been going over the estate paperwork again. And something doesn't add up. Caleb remained silent. Victor walked slowly around the cabin. You see, he continued, Margaret sold her shipping company years ago. Caleb felt a small tension tighten in his chest. Victor noticed. And the money from that sale? Victor said thoughtfully. It's missing. The room went quiet. Atlas shifted his weight slightly. Victor turned again toward the cabinet. Now, I'm not saying there's something inside that thing. He tapped the wood lightly with his knuckles. But Margaret always liked hiding things. Tap, tap. Atlas's growl deepened. Victor smiled slightly. Relax, boy. Caleb pushed himself away from the wall. That cabinet is mine. Victor looked back at him. I know what the will says. Then you know the conversation's over. Victor studied Caleb for a moment. Then he shrugged. Maybe. He stepped away from the cabinet. Or maybe I just wanted to see your face. Caleb said nothing. Victor walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused and looked back one more time. You know what I think? Caleb waited. Victor's smile returned. I think Margaret left you something more than an old wardrobe. He opened the door. Cold wind rushed inside again. And I think sooner or later, Victor added quietly, I'm going to figure out what it is. Victor stepped out into the snow. The SUV engine started moments later. Headlights swept across the cabin windows before disappearing down the narrow mountain road. Silence returned. Atlas stopped growling. Caleb walked to the window and watched the vehicle's taillights fade into the darkness between the trees. After a long moment, he turned back toward the armoire. Atlas returned to his place in front of it, guarding. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck slowly. Well, he murmured. Looks like we're not the only ones thinking about that cabinet anymore. The fire crackled softly. Outside, snow continued falling over the quiet mountains. And somewhere down the winding road, Victor Dawson was already planning his next move. Because suspicion had begun to grow. And once suspicion starts, it rarely stops until the truth is uncovered. Morning came slowly over the Rocky Mountains. A pale gray light slipped through the tall pine trees and across the narrow dirt road leading to Caleb Dawson's cabin. The storm from the night before had left a fresh blanket of snow across the valley, covering the mountains in silence. Inside the cabin, the fire in the wood stove had burned low.
Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee in his hands. He hadn't slept much. Victor's visit the night before had changed something. The secret behind the armoire no longer felt hidden. It felt hunted. Across the room, Atlas lay on the wooden floor in front of the cabinet, head resting on his paws. The German shepherd looked calm, but his ears twitched at every sound outside. Guarding. Always guarding. Caleb watched him for a moment. "Good boy," he murmured. Atlas lifted his head slightly. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees.
For a moment, the mountains were peaceful again. Then the sound came. Tires on snow. Atlas stood instantly. A deep growl rolled through his chest. Caleb set the coffee cup down. Two vehicles appeared between the trees. Not one, two. Caleb walked to the window. The first SUV pulled into the driveway. Victor Dawson stepped out. The second vehicle stopped behind it. Diane stepped out of that one. And then another man climbed out of the passenger side of Victor's SUV. Tall, thin, gray coat, leather briefcase. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "Guess he brought help," he said quietly. Atlas moved closer to the door. The knock came seconds later. 3 sharp knocks. Caleb opened the door. Cold air rushed into the cabin. Victor smiled. "Morning, Caleb." Caleb didn't smile back. "What do you want?" Victor stepped inside without waiting for permission. Diane followed behind him, her boots crunching snow across the wooden floor. The man in the gray coat stepped in last. Victor gestured toward him. "This is Mr. Reynolds." The man nodded politely. "Private investigator." Caleb folded his arms. "Why is a private investigator standing in my living room?" Victor glanced around the cabin slowly. Small kitchen, old couch, wood stove. Then his eyes settled on the armoire. "Because," Victor said calmly, "I believe Aunt Margaret left something important behind." Diane crossed her arms. "And we're here to make sure nothing from the estate was hidden." Atlas stepped forward immediately. The German shepherd positioned himself directly between them and the cabinet. Low growl. Victor rolled his eyes. "Still guarding that thing?" Caleb's voice stayed steady. "You've seen the will." Victor nodded. "Oh, I have." He walked slowly toward the armoire. Atlas growled louder. Mr. Reynolds opened his briefcase and pulled out a flashlight and small measuring tape. "Just a quick inspection," he said. Victor opened the cabinet doors. The old hinges creaked softly. Dusty shelves. Nothing inside. Mr. Reynolds leaned forward and shined the flashlight along the wooden interior. He tapped the side panel with his knuckles. Tap, tap, tap. The hollow sound echoed faintly inside the cabinet. Caleb stood still. His face revealed nothing. Inside, however, every nerve felt tight. Victor leaned closer. "Check the back panel," he said. The investigator crouched lower and examined the wood carefully. Atlas stepped forward again. The growl deepened. Mr. Reynolds hesitated. "That dog's not very friendly." "He's trained," Caleb replied calmly. Victor ran his hand along the cabinet frame. Then his fingers stopped, right on the carved rose, the hidden trigger. Caleb felt his pulse slow. Atlas exploded forward. The German shepherd barked sharply and snapped his jaws inches from Victor's arm. Victor jerked backward. "What the hell?" Atlas barked again, louder. Mr. Reynolds jumped away from the cabinet. Diane stepped back quickly. "That dog is dangerous." Caleb walked forward slowly and rested a hand on Atlas's back. "Easy." The dog stopped barking, but kept growling. Victor rubbed his sleeve where Atlas had nearly bitten. "Control your dog." "He warned you," Caleb said quietly. The room fell silent. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat. "I don't see any hidden compartments." Victor stared at the cabinet for a long moment, then at Caleb. "You're hiding something." Caleb didn't answer. Victor closed the cabinet doors slowly. "Well," he said finally, "we'll see." He turned and walked toward the door. Diane followed him. Mr. Reynolds closed his briefcase. The three of them stepped outside into the cold mountain air. Moments later, the SUVs started and rolled slowly down the snowy road. The sound of the engines faded into the forest. Silence returned. Inside the cabin, Caleb exhaled slowly. Atlas sat beside him, still watching the door. Caleb scratched the dog behind the ears. "That was close," he murmured. Atlas wagged his tail once. Across the room, the armoire stood quietly against the wall, the carved rose catching the warm glow of the firelight. Behind that wooden panel, $270 million remained hidden in the darkness. But Caleb understood something now. Victor wasn't finished. Men like Victor never walked away from money they believed belonged to them, which meant this search was only the beginning. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the mountains. Weeks passed, then months. The snow around Caleb Dawson's cabin melted into streams that ran down the slopes toward the valley. Pine needles returned to the forest floor, and the narrow dirt road that led to his cabin turned back into mud and gravel. Life on the mountain seemed peaceful again. But Caleb knew better. Because silence didn't always mean safety. Sometimes it simply meant someone was preparing their next move. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, a white envelope, official, stamped with a law firm's seal. Caleb sat at the small kitchen table while Atlas rested nearby, watching quietly. He opened the envelope. The words inside were short, clear, and unavoidable. Victor Dawson was filing a lawsuit. The claim accused Caleb of concealing assets that belonged to the family estate. Victor's attorneys argued that Margaret Lawson had intentionally hidden financial resources inside the furniture Caleb inherited, and therefore, the money should belong to the entire family. Caleb sat still for a long moment. Atlas slowly stood and walked over. The dog rested his head gently against Caleb's leg. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "guess it was only a matter of time." The courtroom in Denver felt very different from the quiet mountains. Bright lights, polished wood benches, rows of observers whispering quietly. And at the center of it all sat Caleb Dawson. He wore a simple suit he had borrowed from a friend in town. Atlas was not allowed inside the courtroom, but the dog waited patiently outside with one of Caleb's neighbors. Across the room sat Victor Dawson. His suit was expensive, his confidence even more so. Diane sat beside him, whispering occasionally to the attorneys. Victor looked across the courtroom and gave Caleb a thin smile. The kind of smile that said he believed the outcome was already decided. The judge entered. The courtroom rose. "Be seated." The trial began. Victor's lawyers spoke first. They described Margaret Lawson's wealth. They described the sale of her international shipping company nearly 20 years earlier. And they explained how a fortune had seemingly disappeared from her financial records. Then they pointed directly at Caleb. "A cabinet," the lawyer said clearly. "A cabinet that mysteriously contains hundreds of millions of dollars. He paused. And the only person who claims ownership is the defendant. Victor leaned back confidently. The lawyer continued. This money, Your Honor, clearly belongs to the Lawson family estate. Murmurs spread quietly through the courtroom. Then Caleb's attorney stood, a calm, older woman named Rachel Martinez. She walked to the center of the courtroom, holding a single envelope. Margaret's letter. Your Honor, she began, my client inherited the Armoire legally through Margaret Lawson's will. She held up the letter. And Margaret Lawson herself explained exactly why. Rachel handed the document to the judge. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read. Minutes passed. Then the judge looked up. Rachel continued. Margaret Lawson did not trust her family to handle her wealth responsibly. She intentionally hid the money and left instructions that the armoire and its contents belonged to Caleb Dawson. Victor's lawyer stood quickly. Objection. This letter could be interpreted. The judge raised a hand. Sit down. The room grew still. The judge looked again at the letter. Then at Caleb. Mr. Dawson. Yes, Your Honor. Did you discover the money exactly as described here? Yes. And the armoire was legally transferred to you in the will? Yes. The judge nodded slowly. He turned toward Victor's attorneys. The court finds no evidence that the defendant concealed assets belonging to the estate. Victor's confident expression began to fade. The judge spoke clearly. The armoire and everything inside it legally belonged to Caleb Dawson. A quiet wave of whispers moved through the courtroom. Victor stared forward in disbelief. Diane leaned toward him, furious. But the decision had already been made. The gavel struck. Case dismissed. Caleb sat still for a moment. Years of training had taught him not to react too quickly. But the weight he had been carrying for months finally lifted. Rachel Martinez leaned toward him and smiled. You're free to go. Outside the courthouse, Atlas waited near the steps. The moment Caleb appeared, the German shepherd ran forward. Caleb knelt as Atlas pressed against him happily. Well, Caleb said quietly, rubbing the dog's neck. Looks like we won. Atlas wagged his tail hard. Across the street, Victor Dawson stood beside his car. His face burned with anger. He watched Caleb and the dog for several seconds. Then he turned and slammed the car door. The vehicle roared away down the street. Caleb stood slowly. Atlas remained beside him. For the first time since discovering the hidden fortune, the money truly belonged to him. Legally. Completely. But as Caleb looked toward the distant mountains, he understood something even more important. The real question was no longer who owned the money. The real question was what he was going to do with it. Spring arrived slowly in the Colorado mountains. Snow retreated from the slopes, revealing patches of green grass beneath the tall pines. Meltwater streams ran along the dirt roads, and the cold wind that once carried winter storms now carried the softer smell of wet earth and sunlight. Life returned to the valley. But Caleb Dawson's life had already changed long before the snow melted. The money was real. $270 million. The number had once sounded impossible. Now it sat quietly inside bank accounts managed by attorneys and financial advisors who called Caleb every week with plans, investments, and strategies. Most of those conversations ended the same way. Mr. Dawson, you could retire tomorrow. But retirement had never been Caleb's goal. One morning, nearly 2 years after the trial, a new road curved through the lower side of the mountain valley. Where there had once been empty land, A group of wooden buildings now stood among the pines. Simple cabins, a large lodge, wide open fields, and a sign near the entrance road. Rocky Mountain Veterans Recovery Center. Caleb stood near the entrance, watching the morning sun rise over the hills. Atlas sat beside him. The German shepherd was older now, but his posture remained proud, his dark eyes still alert. Veterans began arriving just after sunrise. Some drove old pickup trucks. Others arrived in worn sedans or borrowed vehicles. Most of them stepped out slowly, carefully. Men who carried the same invisible weight Caleb had carried when he first returned from Afghanistan. One man stood near his car for a long time before walking toward the lodge. His hands trembled slightly. Atlas noticed immediately. The dog stood and walked toward him, slow, gentle. The man froze at first. Atlas sat in front of him quietly and tilted his head. After a moment, the man knelt. His hand rested on the dog's thick fur. The tension in his shoulders slowly softened. Caleb watched from a distance. This moment was exactly why the center existed. Years earlier, Atlas had done the same thing for Caleb during his worst nights. During the nightmares, during the panic attacks that left him shaking on the cabin floor. Atlas had always known when Caleb needed help. And now, dozens of trained therapy dogs were being raised and trained here to do the same for other veterans. A young staff member approached Caleb with a clipboard. "We've got 3 new arrivals this morning." Caleb nodded. "Rooms ready?" "Yes, sir." He smiled slightly. The word "sir" still felt strange outside the military. But the center had grown quickly. Doctors, counselors, trainers, volunteers, all working together in the quiet mountain valley. Many of them veterans themselves. Many of them had found healing here. Atlas walked back to Caleb's side. The dog leaned gently against his leg. Caleb rubbed the dog's neck. "You did all this," he murmured. Atlas wagged his tail. In the distance, the lodge doors opened as the first group of veterans walked inside for the morning meeting. Laughter echoed faintly across the valley, something Caleb had not heard often when he first returned home. Peace. Later that afternoon, Caleb drove back up the narrow road toward his cabin. The same old cabin still stood at the edge of the forest. He had repaired the roof and reinforced the walls, but otherwise, it looked exactly the same as it had years earlier. Inside, the wood stove crackled softly, and in the corner of the room stood the same old armoire, the carved rose still visible in the warm firelight. Caleb walked over and placed his hand against the wood. He no longer opened the hidden compartment. There was no need. The money had already done its job. But the cabinet remained exactly where it had always been. A reminder, not of wealth, but of something far more important. Atlas walked over and sat beside him. The dog looked up with the same loyal eyes he had carried since the day Caleb brought him home from the military base years ago. Caleb smiled. "You know something?" he said quietly. Atlas tilted his head. "Everyone thought this cabinet was junk." Atlas wagged his tail slowly. Caleb looked toward the carved rose. But it wasn't the cabinet that changed everything. He scratched Atlas behind the ears. It was the dog who found it. Outside, the sun dipped behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in warm orange light. Inside the small cabin, the armoire stood silently against the wall. The same forgotten piece of furniture that once made a room full of relatives laugh.
the same cabinet that hid a fortune no one believed existed. But the real treasure had never been the money. The real treasure had been loyalty, a soldier, and the dog who refused to leave his side. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Right now, drop a quick comment below. You can keep it simple. Just type 1 if you believe a loyal dog can truly change a person's life, or type 0 if you're still thinking about it. I read the comments every day, and it's amazing seeing where everyone is watching from. So if you'd like, tell me what state or country you're watching from too. And if stories like this mean something to you, stories about loyalty, courage, and the quiet strength between a veteran and his dog, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because there are many more powerful stories still waiting to be told. Stories about soldiers, stories about dogs, and the incredible moments that happen when the two refuse to give up on each other.